Well, I heard just a little bit of your prior speaker, and knowing the situation with the legislature and the situation with the schools and everything else that's going on right now. I know that you want to get the most out of your money and you want to know exactly what's going on out there. There are so many factors, so many elements hitting the markets that you invest in, the treasuries and the agencies, the commercial paper, that it's almost overwhelming. Now, it's something that, of course, back in March of 2020, 18 months or so ago, the conditions just totally spiraled out of control. If you remember at that point, the economy was slowing down a little bit. We had had a rousing market and pretty good yields, 2.5%, 3%. Up until the end of 2019. But in the beginning of 2020, the economy started to slow down again, which is natural. It's just, the party was long and it took a little while, and pretty soon everybody gets tired of partying. So they kind of pull their profits out of the markets, and the economy needs to slow a little bit. We didn't, of course, see the fact that the conditions would spiral so much with COVID-19, because with COVID, it just stopped all the interaction. And when that happens, people lost their jobs, and so they lost their income. When they don't have income, they stop spending. When they're not spending, businesses can't stay open, and they suffered for a long time. And then so many of them just gave out altogether. And since there's no spending going on, it's again this big, deep hole. It's like water going down a drain. The supply chains that supply and bring all of the products into the United States and around the world, they kind of withered. First of all, they didn't have enough people working to keep the ports open, since most of the goods in huge volumes come on the shipping lanes. And then, of course, we had the ship that got crosswise in the Suez Canal. That was just, what more can you do to us kind of thing. The supply chains started to wither. And since we've actually had the third largest container port in the world, which is outside of Shanghai in China, that's actually been closed because of COVID concerns. The health of the workers there, as well as getting the products to the containers and then getting the containers across the ocean and then finding somebody to sell them. You can see how totally dependent we are in a global society, especially on these supply chains. And you really can't emphasize enough about the supply chains and how that has affected us, and how it's going to continue to affect us, because now with the Delta variant and the fact that once you get this all blocked up and goods aren't being produced on the other side, it slows everything down. In fact, if you think about it, you might do your Christmas shopping a little bit early, because the Christmas holiday is going to be quite expensive. And then, of course, also just speaking of supply chains and the shipping and the ports, one of the things that happened in this supply chain situation is the chips, the semiconductor supply has dwindled and stopped. One, because they can't get it transported, and two, because they can't produce enough. Because when everybody went to COVID and started working from home, and the kids were at home and they're working on their PCs and their laptops, I guess it's more laptops now, working on their laptops, well, those all take chips. And so the chip supply was depleted very, very quickly. And just keeping that going through, you've seen the effect of that, interestingly enough, on cars, and the fact that used cars got so expensive. They're finally starting to come down a little bit, but they got so expensive for about the last 6 months or so. And that's because we didn't have enough chips to put into the new cars, which are so chip dependent. And so since you've got a lesser supply on that, then the used cars became very, very popular. And that's why they went out of sight expensive. Um, yeah, just as an example, a neighbor of mine had an old car and I helped them wash it and buff it up and everything. And we thought, oh, maybe they can get book value out of that. They got almost twice book value off a 7-year-old car. It's just craziness. But it all goes back to those supply chains. And those supply chains then, of course, affect how many people, if there's not enough product in the business, that stops the businesses. It truly is a spiral and a down the drain kind of situation that we're looking at to a certain degree. Now, the economy, I've mentioned some of the major headwinds that it's been facing, and it's not just the supply chains, it's not just COVID. Of course, COVID is the one that's kicking this off and creating most of it, but now we have the Delta variant. Think back over the last year, we have had feds changing and supporting, and we'll talk more about that. We've had Afghan pouring out of Afghan. We've had several hurricanes, not just Ida. I think we're up to Sam now in the alphabet. And then on top of all of this, we have a dysfunction in the Washington sphere in trying, and we had an election in there and a big change. There's just everything pointing to a perfect storm here. Now, the headwinds in the manufacturing has been able here in the States to continue to grow, which is great. We've actually had 15 months of consecutive growth there. And some of that is coming from increased orders and a backlog of orders. And unfortunately, the backlog of orders doesn't help much if you can't get the supplies. So it's growing. It has been strong. It's been one of the major factors, that and housing, that have looked so good for so long. But it's struggling now until we can get some of this open, which we were starting to see open before the Delta variant hit. Mentioned about the Chinese ports and the shipping crisis. I think one of the things that's interesting, and this is almost unbelievable for my little head to grab, but in looking at some background on the shipping, an iPhone has as its sources that then go into the pieces that then go into the iPhone, 20,000 sources of those materials. And so it's not a direct line, a couple of dots on a supply and shipping and supply disaster. It is multitudinal and it's global, since we had been moving very nicely towards globalization of the economy and the sharing of information and the sharing of this and that. And global supply chains were doing really, really well up to and through 2019. But of course, that has just stopped. And in a matter of fact, I think deglobalization is a little scary here, because you saw the first parts of that right at the beginning of COVID, because COVID started with the vaccines as they came out. Countries, and you still see it today, the countries saying, no, I'm not going to give up my supply. I'm using my supply here, which of course has left Africa terribly exposed, and some other areas also. But you know, that deglobalization, or that pulling back in, that isolation, isn't going to be good for anybody. And so we have to get over this problem, and we have to make sure that we get our supply chains going again, which will then naturally include and move towards globalization. And if manufacturing was one of the good areas, housing, even with the headwinds that they've been facing. So as you had the supply chains and the supplies, just the mining of materials, for instance, and aluminum and copper, to a certain extent, plastic, and definitely lumber, a lot of which comes from Canada. Those have been so impactful in housing that housing prices, as I mentioned here, is literally through the roof. They are starting to come down now, but a couple of things were feeding into that. First of all, the prices themselves going up because it was a buyer's, it was a seller's market, and still is. But it also is due to a certain extent because of, and I'm sorry, somebody just rang my doorbell. So now my dog will start barking. So I'll apologize now and hope that they go away. It happens. I was just talking about everybody moving to working at home, and this is one of the barriers that we face and headwinds that we face working at home. But one of the things on housing is that so many people, because they found they could work remotely, they started moving out of the dense metro areas and were able to go into the other areas and start to buy homes, single family homes, get out of that apartment kind of situation. So that kind of fed into that too. But all of that has created a housing boom. And nationally, prices are now 41% higher than the peak of the housing boom in 2006. That's amazing. If you think back to what was happening then, that was when we were really saying everybody in the world should have a home. Credit was being given so liberally to it that if you breathed and passed the mirror test under your nose, that you could buy a home. And that was that situation in 2006. And now we're 41% higher in the prices. That is incredible, absolutely incredible. I think the consumer was staying with us for a long time in the economy, but now the consumer confidence is starting to wane a little bit. It's starting to wane because it is there are just too many things factoring in here. And you can see on that chart on the bottom left, on the bottom right, that consumer confidence took that tremendous hit at the beginning of COVID. It was coming back, but now, especially with the Delta variant, that you can see it's dipping back down again. So we have to make sure that the consumer confidence, which has dropped to now a 6-month low, is going to come back up again. We've got to get their confidence back up again, because consumers drive the American economy. We're just not a nation of savers. We go out and we love to spend. So what's the Fed been doing all this time? Well, you know what's been happening with the rates, because when COVID hit, the Fed took it down to the overnight rates down to 0. And we'll see this a lot through everything here. We actually have, this is a great day for talking about economics, because the Federal Open Markets Committee met this week, and it was more or less what we expected. Chairman Powell is absolute master at staying pretty vague. We were looking at this meeting to probably be a dud, because we didn't expect anything changing with the rates. But what did change, which should give you a little bit of hope, because as Ramallah said, you're going to need all the income you can. They have now recognized in their statement and in his press conference, which, by the way, if you hear the term, that's what people call his presser, which is his press conference. After the meeting, he very clearly said, and I think their notes will also say this, that the whole committee now recognizes that there's been tremendous improvement in the economy. And the TAMPRA, the support that they've been giving, not by rates, but the support that they've been giving, the accommodative support for the economy, which is what they buy every month, that has been confirmed that they want to stop the tapering. I mean, they want to stop the tapering. They want to stop the supply, the additional accommodative money that they're throwing into the economy. And they want to stop it by mid-year of 22. Well, that means that they have to start it probably in January or February. And that will make a tremendous difference in our curve and in what they are intending to see. Now, that what you see on the lower right-hand graph there, that's, and I'm sure you've heard the term, the dot plot. The dot plot is what the Fed gives out as the members of the Federal Open Markets Committee, the ones who are voting at any one particular time. And it gives us an idea of where they think interest rates are going. Now, they're particularly talking about the overnight rate, which will and does absolutely control what you're getting out of the pools. So you can see that in 22, they are starting to move up, and many of the individual Federal Reserve presidents have come out and said that we need to maybe look at the end of 2022 to raise that federal funds rate, the overnight rate. But look at the difference between the white line and the green line, that they have now changed, and they expect the overnight rates to go in 2023 up to 1%. And keep moving up there to potentially a 2.5. That's really getting up there on a long-term basis. But in 2024, be hitting about 1.6 or 1.8. So that's a big major difference there. And we talk about this taper a lot, just for your general information, in case you're not sure exactly what they're talking about on the taper. What they're saying is that since the beginning of the problem with COVID, they have been buying $120 billion worth of supply of treasuries and agencies and even some other corporate securities. They buy $120 billion worth of that every month. So they have built up quite a tab on this particular item. And why they're doing that, particularly in the long end, is that they're trying to keep, if they keep buying the securities, it takes the securities out of the market, and it's a supply and demand issue. So if they take the supply out by buying it themselves, so they're buying their own product, they then swoosh all this money, 120 billion, into the economy every month, and they pull the supply out, which makes the supply more expensive, which we know rates go up and prices go down and vice versa. And so it keeps the long end of the curve, the 10 to 30 year, lower in rates. The reason they do that, of course, is because housing is so important to the economy, and they want mortgages to be cheap. And obviously they've done that. You know, we're actually seeing some some rise in those prices, but obviously they have kept that, and that has been throwing the money into the economy. Now, what's happened because of that is that our economy is totally awash with liquid funds. I mean, it's incredible what has happened here, because um, the what's happened is that we have so much money in the economy that that's starting to distort the economy, and it's distorting the markets also because there's just too much money in there. That's one of the reasons that the short end, where you basically invest out to the 1 and 2 year area, has been so flat and will continue. They have to start pulling that money out. They can't pull it out until they sell those securities back, which they won't do quickly, because that would shock the market too much, and those long rates would just, they would skyrocket. So they won't do that quickly, but what they've got to do first is to stop buying. And every economist on Wall Street assumes now, after his statement this week, that that purchase will stop. We will have an announcement of it in November, that they will stop at the meeting in November, and then that they will actually start to taper off. They'll probably go to 100 million or 110, probably 100 million and $20 billion increments, and bring it down, so that they can bring that down by the middle of 2022. It's a staggering number, and it is it's kind of been referred to as a taper tease, because we've been waiting for it. We're waiting for it because the market knows it has to come out there. One of the reasons that I say it's distorting the market is because there are many institutions like your own, like huge university funds like UT, like huge pension funds, that yes, they have to use the stock markets, which of course has just gone totally bonkers on this liquidity that's out there. But it's distorted it because it's saying, I have to use these securities. I have to use the 10 to 30 year bonds. And so that's just driving that price up higher and higher, and pulling the rates lower and lower. And of course, the problem for the pension funds is huge. Right now, it's being offset with the stock markets, but most pension funds average, their target is 7% earnings a year, and they can't get anywhere near that in the bond funds. And of course, that is why you see part of this huge run, this huge historic bull run in the stock markets, because there's so much money, and who's going to buy something at 1.5 and have to hold it for 10 years when they can go into the stock market? So that has thrown a lot of that money into the stock market. Now, another thing that's happening here is that with so much liquid money in the economy, it's hurting our banks. And I know I've talked to many of you about the fact that banks don't want you anymore. You're very expensive as a public entity for the collateral that we require, but also because the fact that a bank with a flat yield curve like that, they can't make any money. So we don't want to get to the point where we have a situation where it's hurting the banks. Now, the banks are strong because they're holding so much cash right now, but they're also weak because they can't make any money. Okay, and then there's another factor here. I brought it down in the last bullet point. There is the debt ceiling, and of course we had a little bit more information on the debt ceiling actually just this morning. Um, the debt service, the debt ceiling vote should come out of the Senate on Monday. And what's happening with the vote on the debt ceiling is that, and I'm not trying to be partisan here, it's just easier to say it. The Democrats want to suspend the debt ceiling. Now, the debt ceiling is set, and it started back in World War I. The debt ceiling is set and has to be voted on if we're going to acquire more debt, which makes a heck of a lot of sense to you and I, but apparently doesn't to Washington. So what the Democrats are trying to do is to suspend it and say, we don't need a debt ceiling. Well, the Republicans are saying, no, you're not going to do this. So on Monday and next week will be very interesting to watch, because they have two choices. They can pull the debt ceiling suspension out of the bill that's being voted on with some of the other stimulus programs, or they can just let the government default. And that would be the first time. This goes well beyond partisan politics. This would be the first time that the United States would default on its debt. And you know what would happen to you if you defaulted on your debt. And that's what we're looking at, that on a national basis. So this is a situation that you might want to keep your ear open for. The funding actually runs out next week. I guess that's Thursday. No, it runs out today, 9:30. No, it's next week. I'm confused. It runs out on 9:30. And so this decision has to be made by September 30th. And so it's going to be an interesting kind of situation to watch, and to watch closely. Now, one of the things that is running very, very high, if you and I know that it costs a lot more to go to the grocery store. I always laugh about my cable bill. Anybody who says there isn't inflation doesn't pay for a cable bill, or a phone bill for that matter. But inflation, I love this William Simon quote. He is a prior Secretary of the Treasury from many years ago. He says, "I continue to believe that the American people have a love-hate relationship with inflation. They hate inflation, but they love everything that causes it, because what causes it is growth." And that's why the feds want the inflation. This is what they've been watching. They're watching jobs and they're watching inflation. And they have to get the inflation up. For the last 4 or 5 months, we have heard constantly about the fact that, is this inflation that we're seeing, is it transitory or is it permanent? If it's transitory, they don't want to take their foot off the pedal and allow the rates to go up, because then they'll go up too quickly and they'll stay up, and they won't be able, it's harder to bring them down and rein it in. But if it's transitory, it means it's mostly being created through COVID. So if we can get a handle on COVID, then maybe we can see, and I have a chart in here a little bit in a minute or two about what's happening with that and how that will affect us if we can get COVID under control. Because eventually inflation becomes a threat to employment and positive income, because you're having to pay out of your set income more money. What's worse than inflation? It's deflation. And that is that the prices are falling and everybody takes the attitude of, I won't buy it today anyway. I'll wait because it's going to be cheaper tomorrow. And that's a dangerous kind of situation for the consumer and for the nation. Now, stagflation is another thing that has been talked about a little bit. It is kind of it's in the back of your head, this could happen. Stagflation is a stagnant economy, but with high inflation. And so you can see the balance that's coming here between getting the businesses started and getting those supply chains moving again. If we could just get some of the supply chains and the ports open and so forth, that would help a great, great deal. This chart is interesting because it shows you the COVID impact, really. So the red bars, the real deep red, the sensitive items, like it says, lodging or used cars, airlines, televisions, toys for Christmas, personal computers, those have been tremendously impacted by COVID and therefore have created that big hike in the core consumer price index. You have pretty steady on the rest of it, the core staying relatively steady until it gets to the COVID kind of impact items that have been and will continue to be impacted by COVID. The other things, as I say, are the Fed watches so closely is inflation and also jobs. And the jobs, obviously, you've got to have a job to spend the money to spend as a consumer. And so we need to have the jobs, and the jobs are strong right now. As a matter of fact, we're really in a kind of unusual situation. Currently, there are 1.3 jobs for every unemployed person. So every unemployed person out there could get a job in a third. The difficulty for hiring them is I'm not sure anybody knows exactly what this is all about. Some of it is because of healthcare concerns. Some of it is experience because we don't have people coming out and new into the economy who have the skills that are needed, whether it's welding or truck driving or medical. We have a lack of that across the board. A lot of it for a long time when we're totally remote was daycare issues and the fact that the schools were closed. So in closing the schools and going to remote learning, that's impacted female workers tremendously. The stat I've heard is 75 to 80% of female workers were impacted and maybe had to give up their jobs. Actually, we saw a lot of high school students coming in and taking jobs and leaving school. And you're probably more familiar with that than I am. Leaving school to go home, to go and get the job so that mom can stay home. There's just a really critical need for us to get people back to work. And of course, a lot of that is going to be vaccinations and masks and so forth. It's interesting to watch that those who are aged 25 to 54, the prime earning times, the participation rate is pretty low, but you can see that the aqua or the greenish line there is the labor force participation for those key areas. And then the labor force participation right on the right hand side. So we're running 60 to 66, 65%, but a lot of that is coming from our hardcore earners right now. We need to get more younger people into the mix. We are definitely slowly, as I say, manufacturing. Housing's calmed down a little bit if we can get the chips going here. What's happening now is that we're slowly coming out of this. I think it's going to be a lot of changes, and some of them pretty massive and widespread because of what's happened to us. We've got, of course, the social side of the economy opening. The economic situation is looking ever brighter. Even the Fed is deciding that that's going to happen. The central bank is starting to recognize that they need to pull back a little bit here. Over the last, actually started before, it actually started in 09 and 10, when that was the first time that we saw accommodation or buying of those securities to support the economy. We have been really controlled and really saved by the Feds and the other central banks of the world, because it was monetary work, that monetary support, because basically the governing bodies, the fiscal side of it, not the monetary side, the fiscal side wasn't doing anything. And so the central banks have been very important. And now it's very important for them to watch and see as they pull back, just like our Fed is. And it's beginning to look like Canada, the UK, and the Eurozone will pull back. Even China, to a certain extent. China came out, I guess it was yesterday, and really slammed cryptocurrency as being illegal in China now. And that's, a lot of that is due to what happened with Evergrande and the real estate. But that whole mix is going to change again, hopefully, so that we can get the central banks out of there to this massive amount of liquidity that they've thrown into the economy. And now we're going to go see the business investment. There's no telling what's going to happen with the stimulus. I've given up guessing. But the stimulus program that is on the fiscal side coming out, the $3.5 trillion, that of course is fueling this really contentious discussion about what happens. Do we need to have more stimulus in there, just throwing money out into the economy, or do we need to have to support business, because business is going to be the one that actually distributes that money? And you can see what's happened here. I mean, one of the main things that's happened over the last year and a half is the fact that we've had a wider separation in lower income and higher income people. That gap has just grown. Well, it's grown because of so much fiscal stimulus, but not filtering down, and not just in direct payments, but filtering down into business, who then buys supplies, who gives people work. And, it's just capitalism 101. That's what we're seeing here. We still have multiple barriers to the growth, the tsunami of liquidity I've been talking about, and hopefully Delta variant is the last variant, but I doubt that also. The eviction protection is another area that's going to impact us, and impacts many, many millions. I've forgotten how many millions of people. The fact that we had eviction protections in place during the first part, put in place during the first part of COVID, that you couldn't evict somebody. Well, that's great, and I applaud that, because we don't want to create homelessness, but that means the people who own the buildings don't get paid. They can't pay their debt. They go out. It's that spiral situation again. And that should be Evergrande, not evergreen on the slide. But Afghans and the immigration from Afghanistan is going to be another barrier to growth. And you down on the border with the immigration coming in from Haiti, and how that's handled, and is it being handled correctly, is another big barrier to growth, because as these kinds of problems come up, too, it adds to the Washington dysfunction, because they're dealing with the debt ceiling, with the Afghans, with the immigrants, with you name it. And so they're not focusing on what has to be happening here, which means we have to get the economy moving. Oops. So what's it done to you? Well, a lot of it comes from the fact that there's uncertainty. Obviously, I have thrown out a multitude of uncertainty factors to you here about, will they come up? Will they go down? What's happening? Well, that all just filters and is reflected in this chart. And that says that when people are uncertain and they don't really want to go out to the 10-year at a 133, which is just horrible. And that end of the curve is just for the bettors at this point, and the speculators at this point. But they're staying very liquid. And that means that there's so much money staying liquid that they have to put it somewhere. So they're going into the front end of the curve. They're buying up all of the supply that's there, and that pushes the prices up and the rates down. So as long as we have this situation and that uncertainty continues, then we're going to have this very flat curve. It will start to move when they taper. But we're going to have to deal with the fact that lots of things have changed. The fiscal versus the monetary policy guides, the income differentials, the liquidity structure, even down to how you interact with your constituents. And your last speaker was talking about it. I thought it was interesting about with the government and how the government sees their constituents on a local level, state level, national level now, and how that is changing and becoming, because of the stresses of the situation, much more difficult and much more disruptive. So the further we go along with this, the more destructive and disruptive we are going to be as an economy, which is very, very scary to me. And also the income differentials, which I mentioned before, that has just been exacerbated by this whole situation. And that's going to add to more and more disruption. I mean, you could look at everywhere down to gun control. It's affecting everything. That last point on the globalization, I think you started, as I said before, you started to see some change over the vaccines. Now, since we've been globally slow for a long time, you might see some more isolationism by countries, including our own. Bring the manufacturing back, bring everything back again. You know, it just can't be done anymore. You have to go where the cheap labor is, and that brings all the countries up. That brings everybody up. So the globalization, which has been slowed down here, that trend has to change, hopefully will change. You know, all of this is really not something that is terribly, terribly different. We didn't go into a depression here. We went in, and very quickly, into a recession. And a recession is a contraction. So when you have things cranking and everybody's happy and the economy is producing and the supply chains are moving and people are buying, that's the expansion. And then we get to the peak. We were already at the peak in 2019 in December. And that was that slowdown that we talked about at the beginning of 2020. But then COVID took us immediately down, much faster than normal. In fact, a recession is usually not called by the bureau that defines the recessions for us. It's usually not called until about the next year. But within the first 2 months of COVID hitting in March of 2020, they had already proclaimed this a recession. They've also claim that we are now out of it. So we have hit that red line and we've bounced back up again. And now we're going into expansion. So we have to now look at how we can get through the recessionary period and get the economy moving again. You know, recessions, they sound so scary, but they're not new. And as a matter of fact, I went back and looked, well, if you had in the 70s, we had the oil prices, restricted output, and that was OPEC was starting to flex its muscles back and then and pulled everybody down as gas prices went absolutely nuts. And then in the 80s, we had the savings and loan crisis. We had total out of control inflation there. And that's why that had to be pulled back in again very quickly. And part of that pullback was the stock market correction in 87. And then in the 90s, of course, you had the technology sector crashing down. You had Enron and some of the other accounting scandals that happened there. And of course, we had 9/11. And then again in 2010, I didn't put it on here, I should have. And again in 2010, we had the housing situation and where we had allowed everybody to have a house and a mortgage at next to nothing. And so then they found out they couldn't pay the bills and oh my goodness, I buy a house and I have to pay the mortgage and I have to pay for electricity and I have to cut the grass, and that turned into another recession in the 2010s. So I guess we're really kind of we're exasperated because of COVID, but we were already going to look at a recession in 2020. I mentioned the Fed because they are front and center right now, and they have been front and center throughout the whole thing. I kind of call them the first responder, and not just our Fed, but the central banks around the world. They did a tremendous amount during this whole COVID situation. They, if you remember, and I'm sure you do, we went in the pools from 1.5% to zero, literally overnight, as they just took it down and they said, okay, we have to make money cheap here so that people can get loans so that they can make it through the recession, which is a normal kind of situation. And then they had just started to stop the buying of securities from the 08, 09, 10 housing recession. And they implemented the $120 billion per month that they have up until now for 18 months been buying every month. So throwing that kind of money into the economy to make sure that we didn't have runs on banks and so forth. They opened corporate credit facilities. They opened municipal debt. It was a market that was seizing up, and the Fed stepped in and provided a funding facility, which just is the grease in getting the funding facility. And that happened for commercial paper and it happened for municipal debt. And very, very quick. They were very, very quick, like within a week on each one of those. Some of the other things that are a little more obscure, the discount window for the banks that are borrowing from the Fed, and the reduced swap lines, which is all the overnight money and the debt fixed to floating. That has all been from the Fed as the first responder. And they have been supporting 3 trillion. And so we've had 3 trillion. We're up to about $6 trillion in stimulus going into the economy that we hadn't had before. Just to remind you, and what's going to happen here is that they're going to use their whole toolbox, and that's what they've been doing. They cut the Fed funds, which is the overnight rate that banks effectively trade between each other at the end of each day so that they don't have money sitting there idle. So the Fed funds, they've brought it down to make sure that there was excess in there so that we didn't have any kinds of liquidity problems. Now we have the opposite liquidity problems. We got too much of it. The discount rate is another tool that they use. If a bank can't borrow from another bank, then they go to the Fed. And so they've lowered that rate. The reserve requirements, quite interestingly, and some of your banks may be proposing situations where they have actually lifted some of their reserve requirements. But in order for any bank to have a client, they have to keep reserves on hand. And of course, that's part and parcel of what happened with Evergrande and also what happened with Robinhood a couple of months ago, is that you have to have those reserves on hand. And the reserves were high especially because of the housing situation in 08 and 09. And the banks across the world have lowered those a little bit, again, to keep things moving. Now, one of their main tools is the open market operations, where this is that 120 billion. Because think about what they do when they buy 120 billion worth of securities. They are putting $120 billion into the economy. So they still own something. So it's not just a one-sided transaction, and they will eventually get rid of those or just let them mature off. But they're long securities, and they're not going to start maturing for another 10 years or so. So all the trading that they do is what the street watches, and how they do that, whether they're doing repo, how they're doing the taper. That's why it's so important for what's going to happen to the rates going forward, is to watch what's happening with these open market operations. Besides the fact, it's just fascinating. What the Fed is trying to do is keep their monetary policy targets in place. And they watch basically the two big ones. They really want unemployment below 6.5, which of course we have. And it's nicely riding at a nice solid pace now. The other thing they have to see is that balance. They have to see the core inflation. They would really like to see it about 3%. Their target traditionally is 2 to 2.5. And then they'll also watch the gross national product, or the gross, who dated myself there, it used to be GNP. It's gross domestic product. And they want that to be a nice solid, and that's of course where we have some problems now. You've probably heard the term the dual mandate. And actually, that's the dual mandate. The mandate is that they keep unemployment down, so every full employment working, and they keep inflation in check. So it's those two things which make up the dual mandate. And this is what it looks like graphically. It's looking at the economic conditions internally, but now, of course, it has to watch the international policies and conditions also, because we can't stand alone. We don't stand alone. No country does. Even China. Nobody stands alone. So you have to watch, and we need to have, that's why there's a concerted group of central banks that are constantly talking, so that we all bring the entire world up in economic conditions right now. And the policies and how that is working is what causes us to see how close we are to the target. You can see in 2018 and 2019, even in 2017, we were very, very close to a nice, perfect blend there between the core inflation and the price stability. And now we're out of the ring. We're moving back that way, but currently we're looking basically at the red circle here is we're far away from their target. And that's why they're keeping their foot on the pedal to make sure that they have enough fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus to keep the economy moving right now. This is a good way to think about it. And the Federal Reserve, this is where this comes from back in June. And what you're looking at here is in 2021, the blue line, we have a huge change in gross domestic product. It looks bizarrely high, but that's because it's a change figure. It's coming off a absolutely flat 2021. So we expect those huge changes in 2020 coming. So we expect them in 2021. Now, it's not that the economy is going to slow down so much. It's going to get into a normal kind of situation in the 1.5% to 3% range over the 22-23 period and then longer. So they're looking for that. And then they're looking for the unemployment rate to be a little bit higher because we're still coming off COVID. And then actually what you're seeing there is they're expecting that to kind of level out and then jump a little bit as we get back into a more normal situation. And what they hope then would happen is that the core inflation will slow down and come down to their 2% level. Now, how those three go together means that they have to keep the Fed funds rate at 0 in 21. They're beginning to think in 22 to make it jump up. But also they don't see a big jump until 2023. So that means that your interest rates are going to stay very, very low in the rest of 21 and into 22 and into 23. Here's another thing that feeds into the point I want to make about your strategies of what's happening here. This goes back to January of 19, and the 2-year Treasury is represented in the, which one is it? The dark blue line. So you can see when COVID hit, it just took that rate down and it's been very, very low. It's starting now in 21 to spread against excuse me, the local government index, which is just going to stay flat here. But the 2-year has a pickup and the 5-year has a huge pickup. Look at that spread, the difference between the green line, the local government pools, and even the 2-year, but definitely in the 5-year. So what that tells you is that if you want to look at your strategy, then the time is long past. And we've been in this so long that many of you with a 2-year maximum maturity, even if you'd bought everything in the 2-year area when it first started, those have matured off. But we have to keep extending at this point. The best point, yeah, it's behind us. But the 2-year area, anything you can get out of the pools to get better than that 0.05 or so is going to look good. And it's time to extend that and look for short-term values, but be very, very careful there. I think your bank rates are going to be extremely low for a long time. And that's just because the banks, they can't borrow from you at a 0.05 and loan out at a 1% and make any money. They need that curve to steepen. And until that curve steepens, which means until the Fed moves, they're not going to see any kind of reprieve here. So The situations are pretty much what we've talked about. The rates aren't rising, but the virus vaccine and getting people back to work and the supply chains are going to be the key there. As soon as you start to see that moving, then you're going to start to see the longer end, what we would call the belly of the curve, which would be your longer end, maybe the 2 to 3 year area, starting to move. I personally think that's what's going to move first. Your pools are going to stay really low, but very slowly in 22, you're going to see the rates go up in that 2 to 3 year area. And in the 2 to 3 year area is really where you need to be looking now. And you need to be looking for better opportunities, whether it's ICS insured cash sweep, whether it's going to other banks, whether it's to looking at commercial paper. Absolutely, you want to be in the prime funds with the commercial paper because that's the only one that's getting, and that's pretty awful right now. We just have to watch that, and we have to watch what's going on to see what's going to impact you on an ongoing basis. Some of the things I've mentioned are purely economic. Will Americans turn to savers? No. And we probably, even if it's a very expensive Christmas holiday, it's going to be a holiday where people will spend, especially if we've seen some improvement in COVID. So sales tax for the cities is going to be a lot better. It's already a lot better than it was last year. But those income differentials will widen, and will widen equality until we can get the economy and the businesses moving again. That's what has to happen to get that, to start moving that gap back down again. It has to come from business. It can't come from strictly the government throwing money out at the problem. And the deglobalization and isolation seem to be, there's some key points here that are happening, and that's what's driving it. Now, how do you drive? This is what you're going to have to do. You go back, use this time to look at your cash flow. If you have a cash flow that looks like this and it's moving in its normal cycles, but you have a lot of money that you never touch, or money that you're going to have around for 1 year, your historical data on your cash flows is going to tell you exactly what you can go out and extend in. If you can just get a little bit better, you're not going to get 1%. You're not going to get 0.5%. But if you can get the portfolio up to a 0.2, a 0.5, you're already 4 or 5 times better than you are right now. And that's what it's going to take. As a matter of fact, if you were an entity that had a 5-year maximum maturity, this would be the kind of distribution that you would be looking at. You would be pushing that money out, the money that you don't need immediately, and not keeping it totally liquid, but moving it out and expanding it across the period. And also remembering that in that circle graph on the top, that, best world, let's say best situation, you want an asset allocation that is diversified. Sure, you want some money in cash and cash equivalents, the pools, for instance, but municipal bonds, treasuries, agencies, you get some diversification in your pools, but they're stuck because they can't invest any longer than 13 months. They're stuck in that flattest part of the curve. So it will improve, but it's not going to improve quickly. It will look better. Your rates will rise, but it won't be in 21. And if you're sitting in the pools, you're probably not going to see any kind of reprieve at all, or very little, until well into 22, unless we can see a major change in the vaccinations and the control of COVID. And then most importantly, on the supply chains and getting our manufacturing moving again, getting our businesses open again. I'm looking at the time. I know I'm over my 1 hour, but
I
if
have
there
a
are any
question.
questions, let me know.
I do have one. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So we see increases on iron and steel. We have some construction projects going on, and they're off by $2-3 million now because of the cost of
Oh,
iron.
yeah.
So we heard that it has to do with our domestic mills increasing those prices because the United States has met their quotas for imports. What's your point of view on this?
I think it's more than that. I think most of our coal anymore, because of the energy push here in the United States to restrict the coal and the emissions that they have, we have been closing mines for years. And so the coal and iron that we get, the preponderance of that comes from China, and it has to be shipped. And that means higher cost all the way across the board. I didn't mention that, but when I mentioned copper and aluminum and lumber, but yeah, the steel and the steel girders, there is nothing cheap about construction right now. But I
So
don't.
are we going to see those prices come down
Oh,
maybe in
yeah.
3 years, 2 years, 3 years?
Oh, I think it'll be closer to 2 years, maybe even if we're lucky, a year and a half. As soon as we can, I don't think that I don't think there's an appetite in the United States to open the coal mines and get those emissions going. It's obviously we're trying to go the other way. But I do think that if we can get the supplies coming in from other countries where we get the ore, then you'll definitely see it come down. And hopefully, I'm a natural optimist, so I'm going to say a year and a half, but for sure within 2 years. Absolutely.
So
I know
there's
that doesn't help you building schools now, but
well, it's because there's a sense of wanting to stall the projects to see that, but I don't know what that
I,
translates to,
I don't
whether
think you can. I don't think you can afford to stall something like that. I mean, you got kids just coming in like another tsunami, and
not
you
here.
have to build those you have to build those schools, and you have to do that work. The one thing that helps you right now is that the borrowing rates are so low, and cities, counties, school districts, everybody has been borrowing money like
Mhm.
mad through the bonds
Right.
and
And
gotten a low rate there. So you
we
actually probably kind of evened out on it.
right, we are using bond funds for that, and we're going we're even not meeting our spend down requirements. Don't tell
Yeah.
anybody, but
Yeah.
so and now we see this crisis on iron and steel. So I have mixed feelings about that, whether we
Yeah.
should go forward and continue. This is a replacement, so we're not
Oh,
expanding.
yeah.
It's
But
renovation.
I do the math on it too. If you were in a normal situation, maybe you go back to some rates, oh, maybe 2018. And if you went in 2018 and you were borrowing funds, you were where 5%, 6%, where now you've borrowed recently and it's more like 2.5%, 3%.
Right.
Well, the cost of the iron on the other side has ballooned, but what was the cost then? I mean, it might be, and I haven't done the math, but I'm thinking off the top of my head that might kind of even out. It doesn't feel good, but it might actually, you're paying less for your money in the first place.
Hmm. Okay.
That's a tough one.
It is. I'll work on it. Thank you.
Linda, this is Romalda. Linda, in regards to Ms. Ayala's comment on the steel and the iron, there are some major supply chains we're facing, particularly in the child nutrition area. We have received communication from our purchasing coordinator that handles some co-ops for South Texas child nutrition programs. And so some of the issues that we're facing right now, of course, are going to be the increased lead times, limited product availability, discontinued items, substitutions, and price increases, among many other items, right? Or other concerns. Is your outlook the same, 1.5 to 2 years, just like you share with Ms. Ayala right now? Or what are we looking as far as those operations related to the
I
food
think that I
nutrition?
really think there'll be a faster recovery there. And that's because those foodstuffs, some of them, of course, are coming very, very far, but the foodstuffs skyrocketed for a while, and they have started to come back down again. But because of growing cycles and seasons, it's going to take a while for that to come back into a more normal cycle. So I would think, you're not even looking a year out on that, would be my guess. Much, much shorter than something that has to be dug from the ground, processed, moved, large areas. They're one of the problems that's going to affect the foodstuffs is that the workers and the migrant workers that we use in Florida and California and Texas, that situation, and the fact that that a lot of people who were not so much migrants, but just normal people working. And I know that schools see this all the time. Remember when you couldn't hire bus drivers because the bus drivers were all being paid by the energy companies that were drilling out in the panhandle and in all of our shale and all of our oil industry. But those kinds of things bounce quicker. And so I don't think that this is nearly going to be the problem the same as the iron.
All right. I guess another point that we wanted to make from region 1 side is you mentioned about the political challenges we face, like the Afghans and some in the Laredo area, of course, and then once again with the international bridges closed and the economy in our area relying heavily on Mexican nationals and their shopping, their vacationing and what have you. So I just wanted to share with you on a point specifically on the Afghans. One of my staff members, her brother is a customs agent living in Arizona, was deployed to Virginia to assist with the situation with the Afghans that were brought into the US. Well, he was deployed to Arizona, didn't last there long enough because not only now we have to worry about COVID, but about chickenpox pandemic that some of the refugees brought with them. So there's other concerns that here we are trying to handle this pandemic, yet we're bringing more into the mix too. Obviously not in the best interest for a lot of us, but because beyond politics and what have you, the nation is intervening in this situation. And so there's other things to consider as well as far as where we're headed with the pandemic. And so I'll just leave that comment alone, not trying to raise any arguments in here. Then on a positive note, we're hearing great comments on the chat regarding your presentation. They're even asking if we can get credit for investment training. We have record of the attendees, so if you want to
I think you could. This is a big part of being an investment officer. Absolutely.
Okay, so then we'll work on that, and thank you, Mr. Moniz, for bringing that to our attention. We'll be coordinating with Linda. We have record of the attendees, and we'll work on those.
And you all take care. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. And you can go over your allotted time. All of this is critical at this point in time. Thank you,
Yeah.
Linda. We appreciate you taking time to go over these items with us.
I enjoyed it. I hope everybody got something from it. Take
Linda,
care, everybody.
Linda, before you
Yeah.
disconnect, you mentioned on the unemployment rate, right? So 6.5, that's what we're looking as far as the nation is concerned. I did get some information forwarded from Workforce Solutions, specifically on unemployment rates for, they track it on a month-to-month basis. So for August 2021 in Hidalgo County, the unemployment rate was 8.9. Stark County, 15.3. Willacy,
Oh,
15.3, yes. Willacy, 10.6. Cameron, 7.9. And in Laredo, 5.8. So
wow.
some are, you know, right below the average, but some others, it's concerning.
Yeah, very much so. Just anybody who's watching employment rates or other localized areas where, most of the information you get is national. The Federal Reserve is a great, and just go to the Federal Reserve in Dallas, their website, and they break Texas up by the north, the south, the east, and the west, basically. But they have some really good information about bringing that information more local and finding out what's happening in your own area. Great source of information.